Picking up from our last discussion on Descartes' views on the relationship between physiology and psychology, we now delve deeper into how he conceptualized the passions. He lays out these five basic emotions: love, hatred, desire, joy, and sadness, and immediately frames them as natural functions. Think of them like built-in software for your body. Their job? To nudge your soul, get it to agree, and ultimately steer your actions towards two main goals: keeping the physical machine running, preservation, or making it run a bit better, more perfect. Now, here's where things get interesting. Descartes sets up this neat dichotomy: preserving the body versus perfecting it. But what if these two goals pull in different directions? Imagine a situation where doing something to make your body perfect might actually harm its basic survival. Or conversely, focusing solely on survival might mean missing out on potential enhancements. This creates a fundamental tension. Which standard should we use as the benchmark for a healthy body? And crucially, which standard should we use to judge if our mind, which relies on bodily information, is itself reliable? Is a body just good enough to keep going, or does it need to be optimized for knowledge acquisition too? This is the crux of the problem Descartes identifies. So, how does Descartes initially tackle this conflict? He gives a rather stark answer: sadness and hatred take precedence over joy and love. Why? Because, he argues, it's fundamentally more critical to avoid getting hurt than it is to chase after things that make you feel good but aren't strictly necessary for survival. Think of it like basic safety programming versus optional upgrades. Rejecting the harmful stuff is non-negotiable. Acquiring the beneficial stuff is nice, but not essential for staying alive. This is his initial take, focusing squarely on the physical, bodily aspect of the passions, their role in keeping the organism safe. But hold on, Descartes immediately throws a curveball. What if we shift our perspective? What if we look at the passions not just as body regulators, but as crucial guides for our thoughts, for our ideas? Suddenly, the weighting could flip. If the primary goal is to have a mind that can reliably process information and build knowledge, then maybe acquiring those perfecting things becomes more important. It's like realizing that while avoiding potholes is vital, having a GPS that helps you reach your destination efficiently is also key. So, the definition of a sound body isn't fixed. It depends on whether you see it merely as a survival machine or as a sophisticated information processing system designed for epistemic success. Okay, so we've got this potential clash: the body's physical needs versus the mind's informational needs. How do we resolve this? Descartes, ever the optimist about reason and order, proposes a solution involving divine benevolence. He suggests that God, in his wisdom, has ensured that these two sets of criteria, the physical ones and the epistemological ones, generally align or at least strongly correlate. It's like saying God tweaked the system so that what keeps you physically healthy usually also helps keep your mind's information processing reliable. It's a bit like a cosmic guarantee that the hardware and software are compatible. All right, divine benevolence handles the general case, but what happens when the two criteria really do clash? Imagine a scenario where pursuing a certain line of scientific inquiry, epistemic good, puts you or your community at risk, physical bad. Who decides which takes priority? Descartes points to the free will. It's up to us individually to make that judgment call in specific situations. But here's the kicker: how do we decide? What principles guide us when the seemingly reliable signals from our body and mind are pointing in opposite directions? And here's where Descartes hits another snag. He admits there are no clear preset rules of thumb from pure reason to help us choose between, say, prioritizing survival or prioritizing knowledge advancement when they conflict. You can't just run an experiment to ask your perfectly rational mind which is more important in this exact situation. So what's left? Back to divine benevolence. But notice the shift. This time, it's not about the correlation between physical and mental health. It's about the connection between what's epistemically sound, knowing the right things, and what's morally sound, choosing the right thing to do with the will. Divine benevolence, it seems, provides the moral compass when reason alone fails. Okay, let's pivot slightly. We've been wrestling with how to ensure our ideas are reliable. Now Descartes asks, besides reliability, what else do these body-based ideas give us? Well, think about basic sensations like hunger or pain. They're obviously useful for keeping the body maintained, which keeps the mind active. An immortal mind twiddling its thumbs isn't doing much science, right? But here's the point. The very essence of the mind, according to Descartes, is thought. Whether you're thinking about God, the mind, or physical objects, you're fulfilling that essence. So, from the mind's perspective, none of these body-based ideas are strictly essential. They're useful, sure, but not fundamental to being a thinking thing. So, if pure thought is the mind's core function, what makes us care about one thought over another? What drives us to pursue science, rather than just endlessly reproving God's existence? Enter the passions. Emotions are what make life interesting. They tell us what's good, what's bad, what's important. They're the secret sauce that energizes and directs intellectual effort. They provide the principles for associating ideas, for knowing where to focus our thinking, and for motivating us to act, to conduct experiments, to write papers, to explore the universe. Pure intellect by itself doesn't push us one way or the other. It's the fire of wonder, a specific passion, that really gets the scientific engine running. This leads Descartes to a fascinating claim. It's the emotions that bring us the benefits of morality. Think about that. Morality isn't just some abstract code. It's tied to our feelings, our sense of what matters. This expands the idea of health beyond just the physical or even the mental to include moral soundness. How do we navigate this? In his treatise on the passions, Descartes tries to evaluate different passions based on whether they're appropriate and rational. He's essentially trying to figure out which emotional inclinations lead us towards good actions and which lead us astray. Let's look at an example, nobility of mind or generosité. Descartes classifies this as a virtue. Now remember, all passions involve bodily changes, motions of animal spirits that strengthen certain thoughts. Virtues are those passions that strengthen well-founded, beneficial thoughts. Vices, like vanity or abjectness, strengthen ill-founded ones. Nobility of mind, then, is a passion habitude, a disposition rooted in bodily processes that inclines you to use your will well and to trust others have free will too. Interestingly, this sounds remarkably like the principle of charity in interpretation. But it's still a passion, requiring the will's active cooperation to generate ideas that go beyond mere bodily regulation. Okay, so we have virtues and vices, passions linked to good or bad thoughts. But this raises a huge question. Who decides what's appropriate? What guides the will when different values clash? Say, the drive to advance science conflicts with protecting the community. Or wonder pulls you one way, while love and generosity pull you another. Descartes seems to hit a wall here. One interpretation, quite radical, suggests values aren't grounded in anything objective. They're just what we choose, like Sartre later argued. The will just picks. But Descartes offers a less bleak, though still limited answer. Maybe the body gives us strong signals, like fear, and virtues like self-respect or nobility of mind give others. Divine benevolence ensures these signals are generally reliable guides, but only as rough rules of thumb. When real conflicts arise, even these signals can't resolve them. God's help goes far, but not that far. Now, Descartes uses phrases like typically cause or naturally correlated with quite a bit. Critics might say, hey, aren't you just making things up? But the author argues this is precisely the point. By showing how bodily states reliably connect to reliable ideas, Descartes is justifying these causal claims. And those appeals to divine benevolence. They're not magic tricks. They're identifying the fundamental preconditions needed for knowledge to even be possible. Where does he need God's help? Exactly at the points where the physical and mental systems need to be aligned. So, finding a sound body gives us a good indication of a sound mind, and studying the body helps us understand the physical basis for a sound mind. It's a practical rule of thumb, not a philosophical bedrock offering absolute certainty. It's worth pausing to consider the context. These weren't just abstract philosophical debates happening in a vacuum. Early Enlightenment thinkers knew this stuff had massive political and theological implications. Maybe Descartes himself, wanting to avoid trouble, tried to downplay the radical consequences of his ideas. The underlying questions were huge. Can regular folks contribute to cutting-edge science? Can they judge it? Can they live reasonably without needing complex proofs, just by trusting their basic instincts and nature's prompts? For us today, grappling with issues like bias and access to knowledge, understanding how Descartes approached these questions about the reliability of ordinary human cognition is incredibly relevant. So, how did people react to Descartes back then? Voltaire, writing much later, gives us a familiar picture. Descartes was a giant, the father of modern philosophy, but ultimately tripped up by his own love of systematizing, leading him into shaky metaphysics like innate ideas. But this wasn't the first reaction. Initially, the criticism was different. People weren't necessarily saying his ideas were wrong, but that they were dangerous for Christianity. He was seen as the arch-enemy of scholasticism, the old guard. Over time, especially by Voltaire's era, the theological heat died down, and Descartes became a respected figure, even within the establishment, though rebels like Voltaire could still critique him, but on different grounds. Despite the pushback, Cartesian ideas spread like wildfire. But this progress came at a cost: official persecution. Church, state, and universities all threw obstacles in the way. It was particularly tough in France under Louis XIV during the Counter-Reformation. Even in relatively liberal Holland, things weren't easy. The reasons varied slightly, depending on the country's religious makeup. In both places, ditching scholasticism made conservatives nervous. But in Catholic France, there was an extra layer of worry. Could Descartes' new physics possibly undermine core doctrines like transubstantiation? That was a big theological red flag. Let's zoom in on Holland, starting in 1641, the year the Meditations hit the streets. At the University of Utrecht, a prominent Calvinist theologian named Voetius went on the offensive. He targeted Regius, a professor who was teaching Cartesian ideas. Voetius was particularly upset by Regius's claim that humans are just an accidental unity, not a substantial whole, a reading of Descartes that Descartes himself never endorsed. Voetius launched a broadside against the whole new philosophy, accusing it of undermining everything from the Trinity to miracles. He even linked Descartes to atheism, pairing his name with a burned heretic. Voetius pushed hard to get the university senate to condemn Cartesianism, framing it as anti-traditional, confusing for students, and dangerously false. In Holland, since universities answered to city councils, the civil authorities got involved too. Voetius, being influential, often pushed them. They restricted Regius's teaching, banned books, and even tried to force Descartes himself to show up and defend himself against libel charges. Thankfully, diplomacy averted that disaster. Meanwhile, at the prestigious University of Leiden, theologians Ravius and Triglandius were spreading slander. They twisted Descartes' methodic doubt, claiming he denied God's existence, and smeared him as a crypto-Jesuit who secretly believed free will trumped God. When Descartes protested, the university simply shut down discussion of him entirely. It seems censorship was often used as the easiest way out. Moving to France, the persecution was more organized thanks to the centralized power of Louis XIV. Same old worries: anti-scholasticism, skepticism, free thinking. But the Eucharist issue added fuel to the fire. There's a suggestion that Descartes, perhaps trying too hard to be helpful, attempted to explain transubstantiation using his own physics, instead of just accepting it as a mystery. His disciples tried to defend this interpretation, but it backfired spectacularly. The result? In 1663, Descartes' books landed on the papal index with a bizarre proviso, until corrected. How do you correct a dead man's work? And in 1667, plans for a grand reburial ceremony in Paris were scuttled by a royal order forbidding any public speech. Bad timing. The Eucharist affair flared up again in 1671. A book explaining the doctrine in Cartesian terms was published without permission and landed on the king's desk via his Jesuit confessor, who labeled it heretical. This triggered a major crackdown. The king, working with university authorities, banned the teaching of Descartes across France, starting with Paris. Other universities followed. Officials complained that Cartesianism was a new and erroneous heresy damaging faith, the sovereign, and the state. The king basically said, stop teaching it to prevent chaos. The fallout was real. Philosophers like Bernard Lamy faced exile and censorship. But even in absolutist France, there was pushback. The Parlement of Paris, a powerful court with censorship powers, refused to join the anti-Cartesian crusade. In 1671, when the University of Paris pressured them to reinstate a ban on non-Aristotelian philosophy, they said nope. Why? Maybe satire helped, like Boileau and Bernier mocking censorship rules so absurd they prohibited blood circulation. More likely, Antoine Arnauld played a key role. This famous Cartesian critic wrote a pamphlet defending Descartes on theological grounds and arguing that trying to censor scientific ideas was futile. His influence seems to have swayed the Parlement. Now let's look inside the Catholic Church, specifically at the religious orders. Generally, they followed the university's lead, banning Cartesian teaching. But the Church wasn't monolithic. There were rivalries, especially the intense Jesuit-Jansenist feud. To understand the nuances, we need to focus on three key players: the Jesuits, the Jansenists, and the Oratorians. The Jesuits are interesting. Descartes was educated by them, and his meditations even echo Ignatius Loyola's spiritual exercises. He apparently hoped they'd embrace his philosophy. Sadly, they mostly reacted with hostility. After his death, they became the main Catholic opposition. They were deeply suspicious of Cartesians, fearing they leaned towards a purely symbolic view of the Eucharist, which clashed with the Jesuits' commitment to scholastic tradition. They were so attached to Aristotle that they'd rather stop teaching than abandon him. This intense opposition even led to persecution, like the case of Father André, a rare Jesuit Cartesian who ended up imprisoned. Then there are the Jansenists, often portrayed as Descartes' allies. Jurieu famously quipped they loved Cartesianism as much as Christianity. But is this true? While figures like Antoine Arnauld, despite his famous objections to Descartes, defended Cartesianism against misinterpretations and saw it as supporting Christian faith, the overall Jansenist attitude was more complicated. Their pessimistic view of human reason after the fall clashed with Cartesian confidence. Nicole, a key Port Royal figure, actually admired Descartes for showing how limited reason is. Pascal's blunt assessment, Descartes useless and uncertain, probably reflects more the typical Jansenist sentiment. Beyond the general philosophical stance, specific aspects of Descartes' thought worried the Jansenists. Le Maistre de Sassy, for instance, was bothered by the mechanistic view of nature. It felt like it stripped away the beauty and divinity from creation. He famously contrasted Descartes' description of the sun as mere metal filings with seeing God reflected in nature. Another Port Royal member, Duvassel, saw the danger in the beast-machine idea, fearing it could easily slide into a materialist view of humans themselves, contradicting scripture. And indeed, later thinkers did develop materialist accounts based on similar ideas. Finally, the Oratorians. Founded to rival the Jesuits, they focused on reviving Augustine, specifically his project of Christian philosophy, the idea that faith and reason work together, with revelation informing philosophy and philosophy clarifying faith. This differs from the Jansenists' focus on Augustine's doctrine of grace. While Descartes, like the Jansenists, stressed the separation of faith and reason, his system still appealed to many Oratorians. Some even tried to bridge the gap, arguing that Cartesianism was compatible with Augustine, hoping to show the Church there were alternatives to scholasticism within its own traditions. Malebranche, as we'll see, is a prime example of this synthesis attempt. Despite the bans and persecution, Cartesianism exploded after Descartes died. His biographer said you couldn't count the disciples. Ideas spread through universities, salons, and even professors used clever tactics to teach him without explicitly saying his name or blaming Aristotle for the ideas. But this wasn't a unified bloc. You had loyalists like Clercelia, who published Descartes' works and fought for church acceptance, sometimes perhaps too zealously, and Rojo, who popularized Cartesian physics, even adapting his approach to appease critics. Then you had thinkers like Malebranche, who significantly modified Descartes' teachings, blurring the lines of what counted as Cartesian. One major development among these modified Cartesians was occasionalism. This is a tricky doctrine often misunderstood as just a fix for mind-body interaction. But it's broader. It claims that finite things like stones or minds never truly cause changes in other finite things. Only God causes anything so. When a stone breaks a window, it's just the occasion for God to act. Changes happen according to laws, but the real causality is divine. It's not a 17th century invention. It has roots in medieval Arabic philosophy. Thinkers like Malebranche, Dulynx, and Laforgue developed it, partly driven by philosophical puzzles about causality, and partly by theological desires to emphasize God's centrality. Alongside occasionalism, Malebranche developed the doctrine of vision in God. This tackles perceived weaknesses in Descartes' ideas theory. Malebranche argued that what we directly perceive or think about aren't mental states, physical objects, but abstract ideas located in God. It's like saying our thoughts tap into a divine library of concepts. This challenges Descartes' neat division of mental and physical, and critiques his tendency to mix logic and psychology. Malebranche extended this even to perception, suggesting we perceive these divine ideas indirectly. Like occasionalism, it has theological roots, echoing Augustine's divine illumination, and builds on Cartesian themes about God's role in knowledge and innate ideas. These developments didn't always sit well with other Cartesians. The famous debate between Malebranche and Arnauld over ideas is a prime example. Arnauld attacked Malebranche's idea of representative beings, calling them unnecessary and unfaithful to Descartes. Malebranche could have just admitted he'd gone beyond Descartes, but he didn't. Instead, he waffled, sometimes saying he found Descartes unsatisfactory, other times trying to argue he was actually following Descartes' lead. This shows even Malebranche, despite his innovations, saw himself fundamentally as a Cartesian trying to stay true to the original spirit. Of course, not everyone was a Cartesian. The opposition was diverse. You had the expected foes, scholastics, skeptical fidists, but also surprising allies, like atomists and materialists who sometimes agreed with Descartes on attacking scholasticism. The fiercest battles were often with fellow moderns like Hobbes and Gassendi. Hobbes respected Descartes as a mathematician but dismissed his philosophy, accusing him of inconsistency. Gassendi, meanwhile, felt wronged by Descartes' dismissive replies and poured scorn on him in his Disquisitio Metaphysica, criticizing his use of skepticism and pointing out the circularity in his argument for God's existence. Interestingly, the scholastics, whom one might expect to be most hostile, sometimes reacted in ways that weren't purely revolutionary. Take Libert Frodmont. He correctly saw Descartes as a mechanist and disliked the crassness of it. But then he bizarrely accused Descartes of being an atomist, a theory Descartes explicitly rejected. Frodmont thought atomism was an ancient heresy already debunked by Aristotle. Later critics like Hewitt echoed this, accusing Descartes of lacking originality and just reviving old ideas. It shows how difficult it was for people to grasp the novelty of his approach. So wrapping up this whirlwind tour of reception, Descartes ignited a massive firestorm. Responses ranged from fierce opposition rooted in theology and tradition, to enthusiastic adoption, to creative modifications and fierce internal debates among his followers. His ideas became a battleground where questions of reason, faith, the body, and the mind collided, shaping the course of philosophy for centuries. It's a legacy of complexity and enduring debate.